I am Eve Choi, and I'm the Curator of Horticultural and Environmental Education at Frederik Meijer Gardens and Sculpture Park. And I want to thank you and welcome every one of you for joining us today, whether through Zoom webinar or Facebook Live. I'm joined today by Dr. Chad Niederhuth, Assistant Professor of Plant Biology at Michigan State University, whose research involves addressing differences in how genes are regulated and how those differences affect plant development and their response to the environment. Dr. Niederhuth, welcome.
Thank you, Eve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we will first explore the fascinating history of tomatoes with Dr. Niederhuth and conclude with a highlight of the stunning heirloom tomato varieties growing at Meijer Gardens, Michigan's farm garden. Following our presentation, there will be a Q&A session with Dr. Niederhuth and myself. We will be taking questions submitted through the Q&A feature in Zoom. While you may submit questions at any time through the Q&A feature in Zoom, we will address all of these at the end during our Q&A session. Throughout the presentation, if you do have any questions about Zoom and need technical assistance, you can also go ahead and use that Q&A feature in Zoom, and our tech assistants will be able to help you there. Now, for those of you joining us from Facebook Live, you may still submit questions that you have during the webinar, and we will get to those as soon as possible after this webinar is completed. Now, without further ado, sit back and enjoy as we listen and learn from Dr. Niederhuth.
Well, thank you very much, Eve, and thank you to Meijer Gardens for this opportunity to talk with everyone today. Give us just a second. So my lab does very basic research in plants. So if you're wanting to know how to grow plants, I'm probably not the person to ask. I'm not that great of a gardener. But what I can tell you about is their genetics and their history. And I find the history of plants to be one of the most fascinating subjects because every crop, every plant that we grow has an origin somewhere. It came from a wild species that we as humans have domesticated. And so the history of plants is really tied to the history of humans. It is the basis for a lot of our culture. If you think about things like cuisine, the clothes we wear, our homes that we live in, so much of those material and food is derived directly from plants. And as I was saying, plants are domesticated from wild species, which means that we as humans have found those species in the wild that have some sort of characteristic that we desire or like. And we've taken individuals from those populations and selected them for those traits that we find beneficial. Things like making them grow better, taste better, be more nutritious. Where plants originate varies widely. So each of the crops that we grow have originated in a different location throughout the world. And this has been closely tied to the settlement of humanity and the growth of cities. So when you think of things like the very first cities, thousands of years ago, groups of people in the modern day Middle East, or historical Middle East, were the first ones to domesticate crops like wheat and barley, which allowed them to settle down and start to build the first cities and nations and empires. Now, the changes that we as humans have selected for and induced in plants can be quite dramatic. And I think one of the most dramatic examples of this is actually corn. So if you think of what the wild ancestor of corn is, it looks very different than what we know today. So there's a plant, a wild grass species down in central Mexico known as teosinte. And here's a picture of what the seeds and kind of the ear of those teosinte plants look like. If you look closely, you can see that there is some of a resemblance to corn, but it's still such a dramatic change that hundreds, thousands of years ago, people started selecting individual plants and selecting for those that produced better, that were easier to harvest, that tasted better. And now we have our modern day corn plants. And the same is true of tomatoes. If you were to see what a wild tomato looked like, you would clearly recognize that it looks like a tomato, but it is very different at the same time. It's this very small little fruit. I'm actually also, despite being a biologist, I'm very bad at Latin, so I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce some of these names. I'll just call it wild tomato and tomatoes. But our domesticated tomatoes that we grow and eat look in many ways very different from those wild tomatoes. They're much larger, they have more flesh, they taste very differently. One of the things we do during this domestication process is we select for those individuals that taste better, get rid of some of those individuals that have kind of these nasty compounds that make it bitter or undesirable. We increase the amount of flesh and reduce the amount of seediness that are in these. And over all these generations, we've gone from this tiny little plant, this tiny little fruit right here, to your modern day tomato varieties. So where does tomato come from? These wild tomato species that were the ancestors of our modern day tomato originate in South America, specifically in the coastal regions of around Ecuador and Peru. There's a wide variety of habitats in these regions, ranging from nearly tropical forests with high rainfall content, but much of it is also very dry, some of the driest deserts in the world. And so if you think about where we grow a lot of tomatoes today, think of regions like the Central Valley of California, Mexico. These are regions that have a lot of the same ecological characteristics of where these wild ancestors of tomatoes came from. These are very species-rich regions. There's beyond kind of the immediate ancestor of tomato, there's many other species that are related to tomato in this area. Tomato comes from the genus Solanum, which actually includes potato. And this is also the same region of the world where potato was domesticated as well. Potato is the basis of the Inca Empire throughout the Andes region. And this is the same area where we find a lot our domesticated tomato came from. But this process was not quick. It was a slow process that's gone on for many, many generations. So starting down there in South America, in this region of Peru and Ecuador, the first kind of initial steps of domestication occurred. But it wasn't quite the same as our modern day domesticated tomato. There's an intermediate form that has characteristics that are similar to our modern day tomato, but also characteristics more like that wild tomato. And so they refer to this semi-domesticated tomato as being very different. Here, we're just going to use this acronym SLC. And so initially, there was kind of this initial process of domestication, semi-domestication in South America. And as humans do, as we move around, as we trade, as one empire or people conquers another, we transport things. We move our culture, we move our food, we move our clothing, etc. And these semi-domesticated versions of tomato made their way up from South America through Central America to Mexico. And it is in this region that we get kind of the final stages of that domestication process. And you start to see the first tomato varieties that really resemble, if you will, more modern tomato varieties originating. So we go from South America up to this region where you have the Aztec, the Maya, and many other peoples. So at this point, tomatoes are really restricted to the Americas. They're not known in places like Europe or India. And it wasn't until much later that the tomato became introduced. And that happened, of course, when the Spanish and other European people started to visit the Americas, to invade and conquer the Americas, and start bringing back materials and plants with them. So it was the Spanish who first started to bring seeds of tomato from Mexico to Spain, where it begins to disseminate throughout Europe to the Philippines, etc. So before the 1500s, tomatoes were unknown in places of Europe like Italy. So people used to eat their pasta without tomato sauce. Pizza sauce was not possible until after the 1500s. And if you think of, I love Indian food, and especially some of the tomato-based curries, that was unknown in this part of the world until well after the 1500s, as the Spanish and other Europeans began to trade and move seeds and these plants throughout the world. Now, this whole process of movement has a dramatic impact on the genetics of the tomato. You start down here in Ecuador and Peru, where you have the wild ancestors and the entire population, and you have very high genetic diversity. Now, as people move the seeds and the plants northwards into Mexico, they don't take that entire population with them. They only take a select few. And so this creates what's called a population bottleneck, where you're taking only a small sample of the entire whole. And the result of that is you end up with a loss of genetic diversity. So moving from the center of origin to Central America, you will have an initial loss of genetic diversity. At the same time, people are selecting for new traits that are beneficial, help plants grow better in their new regions, that have those tastes and other characteristics that they prefer. And so you get also new combinations of genetics that arise. So you'll get the development of new varieties in these regions that are not also found in the original homeland of tomato. And this process continues with each step. So as the Spanish take tomatoes to Europe, again, you're going to have a loss of genetic diversity. You're going to be placing that in a new environment where people are going to select for new traits, new varieties are going to arise. And that's going to just keep continuing as these plants spread throughout the world. In fact, part of that process was as these plants spread upwards into places like England and so on, the English then actually bring the varieties that they have been growing back to the Americas and start growing those in North America in their colonies. So what does this mean in terms of things like heirloom tomatoes? And why do heirloom tomatoes taste so different oftentimes from those store-bought tomatoes? Well, it's due to genetics, and the genetics underlie differences in the chemicals. Yes, there are chemicals in your plant that contribute to the flavor of those varieties. So there are hundreds of compounds of chemicals within the tomato that contribute to the aroma, which is a major part of taste, to the sugar content, to the acidity, all these components that contribute to the texture and the taste of the plant. And so when you start from this period in the semi-domesticated form of tomato, you have this very high genetic diversity. You have a lot of different variants there that contribute to the levels of some of these compounds. So here I'm just showing two major compounds that have been shown to contribute to tomato flavor. And so each one of these different colors in these charts refers to a genetic variant that affects these flavor compounds. And so in the semi-domesticated form, you have this huge genetic diversity. Maybe some of these variants are not actually that great. Maybe they actually impact flavor negatively. But as we humans spread and select on these traits, we reduce that genetic diversity. And so if you look at kind of your traditional heirloom varieties, there's been a huge reduction in the genetic diversity contributing to some of these differences. But in some cases, there's actually been an increase in some diversity. Now, as we produce more and more tomatoes, we start selecting on different qualities. When you think of the fact that you can go to a grocery store and buy a tomato in the middle of winter, that's actually quite an incredible thing on many levels. But that also means that we had to grow that tomato somewhere else, oftentimes Mexico, or a place where the climate allows us to keep growing tomatoes in the middle of winter. It has to then be transported across thousands of miles to your grocery store where it can sit on a shelf for days before you buy it, take it home, and then it sits there maybe for a few more days. And it's still at the end of that has to be something you want to eat. It can't be rotting, it can't have flavor. The flavor cannot be so bad that you don't want to eat it. So what we've done is we've selected for qualities that allow that shelf life. And one of the downsides of that selection process is oftentimes we, at the same time, are eliminating those qualities that make those heirloom tomatoes taste so much better. So it's a trade-off. And I'm not saying which one is right or wrong, but there is a trade-off, and there is an actual reason why those heirloom tomatoes taste so much better, is because they oftentimes have these genetic variants, these genetic ability to produce those compounds that make them taste better. So now I'll hand it back to Eve so she can actually talk about some of these heirloom tomatoes, which I know very little about. Thank you. Eve, I think you might still be on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Niederhuth, for sharing your insight into the history of tomatoes and that fascinating journey that set the stage for what grows in our gardens and has found its way many times to our plates today. And so today, I'm going to give you a sneak peek into some of the stunning heirloom tomato varieties that are growing at the Michigan's Farm Garden. And some of these are also going to be featured at our Heirloom Tomato Weekend event that I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of my presentation. But before we begin, I have a question for you. If you look at the bottom, for those of you who are joining us through Zoom webinar, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little hand symbol where you can click that button to raise your hand. So for those of you with us on Zoom webinar, raise your hand if you've ever eaten an heirloom tomato. All right, we're seeing quite almost everybody is raising their hand. On Facebook Live, you can go ahead and click like. So many of you have tasted and eaten heirloom tomatoes. All right, go ahead and put your hands back down. Now, do any of you, by any chance, have any heirloom tomatoes growing at home? Raise your hand. Oh, again, not quite as many as who tasted on Zoom webinar. Again, those of us who are joining us at Facebook Live, you can go ahead and like if you have any heirloom tomatoes growing at home. But as you can see, many of you have tasted heirloom tomatoes, have tasted that difference, have them growing at home, have experience with them in this way. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into heirloom tomatoes that we have growing at the Michigan Farm Garden. But before we do, obviously we've seen that many of you have different ways that you've already interacted with heirloom tomatoes. I want to take some time to talk about what is an heirloom tomato. We hear that word thrown out a lot. And there are different ways that you can define what an heirloom vegetable is. But heirloom tomatoes, those are typically vintage varieties that are generally known to be at least 50 years or older, with seeds being passed down from generation to generation. So that's one of the ways that we can define heirloom tomatoes. I want to ask you guys to take a second and take a look at the picture that's on this screen. It's a picture of some beautiful heirloom tomato varieties that have been grown in the past at the Michigan's Farm Garden. And I'd like you to make some observations here. What colors do you see? How are these tomatoes similar to what you might typically see in a grocery store? And how are they different? Again, heirloom tomatoes have sparked a lot of interest with their beautiful colors, staggering and stunning different forms. And we're gonna celebrate a couple of those today. We're gonna look at 5 different varieties, but if you come back this weekend at the Heirloom Tomatoes event at our Michigan's Farm Garden, it's gonna be this Saturday and Sunday, we'll be able to see even more and just continue to celebrate this these wonderful types of plants. So a couple facts about heirloom tomatoes. Heirloom tomatoes produce true to type. So what I mean by that is if you save and plant an heirloom seed, you will get the same variety. So heirloom tomatoes reproduce true to type. Heirloom tomatoes also are open pollinated through wind and insects or other pollinators. They're open pollinated. And as I mentioned before, a distinction of heirloom tomatoes is they come in a variety of forms and a variety of color. You have currant forms that may be a 1/2 inch in diameter, cherry tomatoes that could be a 1/2 inch to 2 inches in diameter. Beautiful pear varieties that have that distinctive bottleneck at the stem end, and plum types that are more oblong or cylindrical. We have beautiful ribbed heirloom tomatoes with, that are furrowed and gathered in grooved forms throughout the tomato. You also see globe forms. That's more of the norm of what we see today, coming in many sizes and colors. And then also beefsteak tomatoes, those broad, big tomatoes that are usually very meaty and dense. And then you also have oxheart types that are big and heart-shaped. So a wide variety in forms that you can see with heirloom tomatoes and a rainbow of color. 2 other terms that you'll see when you are hearing about heirloom tomatoes, maybe when you're buying seeds, learning how to care for the tomato plant, you'll hear determinate tomatoes and indeterminate tomatoes. And I'm gonna talk about those here today because it's important to understand how we grow and care for those depending on whether plants are determinate or indeterminate. So when you hear about determinate tomatoes, those are tomatoes that grow to a certain size and then produce all of its fruit at once. These can lend themselves well to large containers. And then you also, and many heirloom tomato varieties are this type, we also have indeterminate tomatoes. And what that means is these tomatoes, these plants will keep growing and sending out new shoots, producing new flowers, continuously producing fruit throughout the season. So with these indeterminate tomatoes, they benefit from caging or staking in the garden. And so when we are looking at our heirloom tomatoes, especially with a number of them being indeterminate, we're going to want to incorporate caging and staking in their care and in our gardens. So now I'm going to show you 5 different types of heirloom tomatoes that you may see this weekend. And there are many more heirloom tomato varieties that we have growing at the Michigan's Farm Garden. And this will give you a sneak peek just at some of the different forms, colors, and different textures and types of tomatoes that you can see at the Michigan's Farm Garden. First, we're going to talk about the black Crme tomatoes. These tomatoes have a dark red, purple fruit with a rich and sweet flavor. They are about 3 to 4 inches in diameter, beefsteak tomatoes, And these types, this particular heirloom always places very high in tomato taste trials. They're very juicy with a large fruit. This particular heirloom variety is from Russia, and it is an indeterminate tomato requiring 80 days from transplant to harvest to reach maturity. This tomato in particular is great for slicing, salads, and cooking. So always a favorite. In stark contrast to the color that we saw with the black Crme, we see the yellow pear also having that distinctive shape of pear heirloom tomatoes. So this yellow pear-shaped fruit is usually 1.5 inches in length. The tomato has a mild flavor and is very sweet. Particularly, it's great for fresh eating and making preserves. Now, yellow pear tomatoes are very productive. It makes them a favorite for growing at home in your gardens. And they're also relatively cold tolerant for a tomato, which this allows them to continue to be productive later into the fall than some other heirloom tomato varieties. This is also another indeterminate tomato requiring 80 days, approximately 80 days from transplant to harvest to reach maturity. This is one of my personal favorites, the Nature's Riddle. Now, what's striking to me about this heirloom tomato is that it's large, bicolor form with the golden yellow with those streaks of salmon pink throughout. They can be around 12 to 16 ounces per tomato, and this particular heirloom from Russia as well is very sweet again and meaty with an excellent taste. Makes this Nature's Riddle heirloom tomatoes great for making tomato pastes and sauces, and it's also good for canning and slicing as well. Nature's Riddle heirloom tomatoes are also another indeterminate tomato, and they take about 85 days from transplant to reach maturity. Another beautiful heirloom tomato that we have growing at the Michigan's Farm Garden is the striped Roman tomato. Now, these tomatoes are about 5 inches long with a pointed, it's a pointed red tomato with wavy orange stripes throughout. It's very beautiful, the two color tones there. Again, this mid-sized tomato has meaty flesh and great flavor as well. It's also very productive, and it's great for both processing and fresh eating. So another favorite. This particular striped Roman tomatoes, it's another indeterminate tomato requiring, again, about 80 to 90 days from transplant to reach maturity. Another favorite, and the last heirloom variety that I'll talk with you today about, again, we have more growing at the Michigan's Farm Gardens. This gives you a little taste of what we have out at the farm, is Black Beauty. Now, this tomato is dark, meaty, very rich flesh tomato with extreme anthocyanin expression. And that is actually the same antioxidant in blueberries and blackberries. So you see that dark color in Black Beauty. Now, its deep red flesh is among the best. It's a favorite as well. It's rich, smooth, and savory with some earthy tones. And fully mature tomatoes can be between 10 to 14 ounces each. It's another indeterminate variety, and it requires approximately 85 days from transplant to maturity. So with these 5 heirloom tomatoes that we talked about here today, if you want to set these up in your garden, including some cages or staking them will be very important for the care of these heirloom tomatoes. Now, this is just a taste of what we have growing at the Michigan's Farm Garden, and we're excited to be able to celebrate heirloom tomatoes all weekend long on Saturday and Sunday. This weekend, August 29th and 30th, from 1 to 4 o'clock each day, we are going to be having activities for adults and children alike, again, celebrating heirloom tomatoes. Now, for those of you who have visited us before at previous heirloom tomato weekends, you may have done some of the taste testing. Now, while we're not able to do taste testing of our heirloom tomato varieties this weekend, we have some really exciting activities that will be taking place. We're going to have tomato voting taking place, some trivia, matchup games. We're going to have mini lectures taking place at the barn, featuring topics from seed savings to tips and tricks for caring for heirloom tomatoes at home. So if you enjoyed learning from Dr. Niederhuth and myself today as we looked at the history of heirloom tomatoes and learned a little bit more about some different heirloom tomato varieties and what makes an heirloom tomato, these mini lectures will continue to highlight some really interesting topics related to heirloom tomatoes. So those will be taking place at 1:15, 2:15, and 3:15 on both Saturday and Sunday. And we invite you, if you want to continue to learn more about heirloom tomatoes, join us for those mini lectures in the barn. We will have a seed saving display also up in the barn throughout the weekend, and we'll have a horticulturalist stationed in the gardens where you'll be able to come and bring your questions during the event. We're also going to have lots of really exciting children's activities taking place, tomato tosses, creating your own tomato creation, using your own unique designs. We're going to have some tomato-themed story times and also a special tomato challenge. So we invite you to join us again this weekend at the Michigan's Farm Garden, where we're celebrating heirloom tomatoes on Saturday and Sunday from 1 to 4 o'clock with lots of really exciting events that you can come and enjoy. And I see that we have some questions that were submitted through the Q&A feature. Again, for those of you who are joining us through Zoom webinar, if you have any questions for either Dr. Niederhuth or myself, feel free to submit those through the Q&A function in Zoom. Now, for those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live, you can also ask questions and submit those in the chat, and we will get to those as soon as possible after this webinar is completed. All right, so as I look at the questions, and again, these can be questions for myself and also Dr. Niederhuth. The first question is, how do you prevent tomatoes from cracking? Now, oftentimes there are a number of different things to keep in mind with tomato care. But probably one of the key things to keep in mind is maintaining even soil moisture. That is a must. Maintaining even soil moisture helps prevent end blossom rot and also cracked tomatoes. You can, through maintaining that even soil moisture, also watering at the base of the plant, whether you're using a drip irrigation system or a garden hose, maintaining that even soil moisture is really important. So just being consistent with how you water your tomatoes. And another question I have, thank you, Cynthia, for asking us, how do you prevent tomatoes from cracking? I know that's a common question I get. We also have Catherine. She asked, will tomatoes be for sale at the event this weekend? They will not. However, I would encourage you to reach out to local farmers in your area or go to local farmers markets where oftentimes you can find heirloom tomatoes available for purchase. Feel free, for those of you who are on Zoom webinar, to continue to submit any questions that you have. I will say, I'd like to talk about a couple tips and things to keep in mind for growing tomatoes as more questions come in. As you're looking for a site to grow tomatoes, they'll need full sun with at least 8 hours of sunlight each day. So that's something that you're going to want to keep in mind if you're thinking about what would be a good location to grow tomatoes at home. Tomatoes prefer a warm, well-drained, but moisture-retentive soil that's rich in organic matter. They prefer a pH of typically ranging from 5.5 to 6.8, depending on the type of tomato or heirloom tomato you're looking to plant. It may be, that range may be more narrow, so be sure when you're buying the seeds or looking into what varieties you'd like to grow, key into those characteristics unique to the plant you're looking to purchase or you're looking to grow in your garden. And then also, I would encourage all of you, no matter what you're looking to grow in your garden, get a soil test. MSU Extension you can work with them to get some soil testing kits. Really understanding the profile of your soil is a key thing to help you be successful in knowing what you can grow and maybe what steps you're going to need to take to be more successful with what you're trying to grow at home. So I really would encourage you to learn a little bit more about the soil. All right, we have San Marzano. We have some questions specifically about San Marzano tomatoes from Italy via Peru, who invented that tomato. I'm not entirely sure who invented this tomato. Dr. Chad Niederhuth, do you?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this particular variety, if we know who invented it. For most heirloom varieties, or even a lot of varieties, except for the most modern varieties, we don't know who specifically invented them. But when you think about heirloom varieties, even though tomatoes originally, their wild ancestors came from that Peru, Ecuador region, and they were first started to be domesticated there, the varieties that kind of moved into Mexico and then initially to Spain would not be a lot of the heirloom varieties that Eve just talked about, or some of these more famous varieties like the San Marzano. What happens is that as they move around, people are constantly crossing different varieties. They're constantly selecting for new combinations of traits, new combinations of flavor, tomato shape, color, all those things that Eve just showed you. And so those get selected for, one farmer in Italy or a set of farmers in Italy may be selecting for those traits that then become those famous San Marzano tomatoes. Whereas we saw in Russia, they're selecting for very different looking tomatoes that then give rise to these very other distinct flavors and color profiles. So it's an ongoing process. Modern plant breeders are still creating new varieties by making crosses and selecting for those traits. So it's a continuous process. But in the case of San Marzano, they would have probably originated in Italy, where they're probably most famously grown, but who did that? I don't know.
I have another question, going back to some of the care for tomatoes at home in your garden. I've heard trimming branches help produce more tomatoes. Is this true? What is the genetic molecular basis of this? if this is true. Dr. Niederhuth, I can talk a little bit about why pruning is important, and in particular for heirloom tomatoes. And then after that, if you want to provide any follow-up, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
But oftentimes with heirloom tomatoes, the emphasis of the importance of pruning is made because removing suckers provides better air circulation, and which helps prevent foliar diseases, which is a key issue for heirloom tomatoes. And it also encourages large fruit production at the top of the plant, primarily improving the air circulation. That is very important, and using pruning to do that to help prevent disease, which is a key issue for heirloom tomatoes. So that may be where you've heard that trimming the branches will help produce more tomatoes, keep the plant healthier in and of itself. Any follow-up to that, Chad?
I don't know if there's much I can say about the genetics or molecular basis of this. I would have to do a little bit of research to see if there's even anything known about that. There's oftentimes, for most traits, some genetic variation within the population. So, you will see some varieties may respond better to such treatment than others. But what the exact basis of that is, I cannot personally say. But it sounds like the explanations you gave, I think, do an excellent job at its overall health of the plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so pruning is, again, really important for overall health and improves air circulation to prevent things such as foliar diseases that would impact the plant negatively. We've got a few more questions. Feel free to type those in Zoom webinar if you have them. Again, if you're on Facebook Live, feel free to submit your questions as well. We'll get to those once this webinar is done. I often get asked about companion plants, so I wanted to provide a list of suggested companion plants to grow with tomatoes to deter some of the pests associated with them. Some great companion plants for tomatoes are basil, chives, asparagus, carrots, marigolds, nasturtium, onions, and parsley. These are all plants that you can plant alongside and close by to tomatoes to deter some of those pests. And another thing that I would like to talk about, as I mentioned, companion planting, is also the importance of generous spacing between your tomato plants when you're setting up your garden. The general standard for tomatoes, or a general standard for tomatoes, is a foot between plants and 4 feet between rows. Again, you're going to hear this theme of increasing air circulation. That spacing increases air circulation and reduces disease pressure. So even though I'm mentioning these companion plants, they can be very helpful to grow. You'll see a wide variety of companion planting in the heirloom vegetable garden beds in the Michigan's Farm Garden. But it's also very important to maintain generous spacing just to, again, increase that air circulation and reduce disease pressure with the tomatoes. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I invite you, if you can, to come back and join us at the Michigan's Farm Garden this weekend from 1 to 4 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday, August 29th and 30th. We're going to continue to celebrate heirloom tomatoes, their history, diversity, their beauty, and the intrigue of these plants through many different activities taking place, again, from 1 to 4 o'clock. Be sure to check in at the Michigan Farm Garden to see what events are taking place. And we hope to see all of you there. And if you aren't able to join us this weekend, we thank you for joining us here live, virtually, as we kick off this celebration of heirloom tomatoes through Zoom webinar. And again, thank you those of you joining us at Facebook Live. I want to also thank you, Dr. Niederhuth, for joining us this afternoon. So much more to the history of tomatoes than I learned so much from this, and there's more to discover too. Sure. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Eve, for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at the Heirloom Tomato event this weekend at the Michigan Farm Garden from 1 to 4 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday.